Hello, and welcome to the 12th episode of Season 2 of House, the Shared Living podcast. I'm Deenie Lee from the Property Marketing Strategists.
I'm Dan Smith from Resi Consultancy.
And I'm Sarah Canning from the Property Marketing Strategists.
And first, a short word from our sponsor.
Housed, the Shared Living podcast, is sponsored by mystudenthalls.com, student accommodation search. Let's find your place.
A big thank you, and do go check out and make sure you're listed where you need to be. Right, I know it's been a really busy time of year with not just Christmas around the corner, but conferencing, and I know that we're all busy with work, but you guys did attend the Westminster Conference a couple of weeks ago, and what was the news from there?
It was a really interesting one. I was on a panel. To be honest, I thought it was a panel. It wasn't a panel. It was effectively me speaking for 5 minutes, and everything that I'd prepped, I threw out the window the moment that I saw a panel prior to mine, to be honest with you. But it was online. Again, I was a little bit disappointed. I thought I was getting a trip to Parliament. It was well curated. It was a good opportunity for people in the sector. Scott Lewis was there, several others too. We basically got the opportunity to say what we wanted for 5 minutes and then kind of discuss it. So it was certainly interesting. These online panels are a good way to get a quick insight, but equally it was a sort of 4-hour long session. So yeah, it was a good, interesting event with a good cross section from agents, universities, key associations, etc., PBSA operators and consultants like myself. So yeah, good opportunity to hear a broad cross section of opinion within the sector. What did you think, Sarah?
I attended as a punter, and I think the kind of the tone was set at the beginning by Rowan Fisher, who's the head of student experience and skills policy at Universities UK. And what I thought was great about that is that he set the kind of the tone that things are changing, that the way students study are going to change. And, the government have an ambition for 70% of over 25-year-olds to be educated to level 4 and above. And they want wider participation. Now, that doesn't just mean from care leavers or estranged students, but it means across the UK as well. There's still a real disparity in accessing higher education across the UK. And, the only way of doing that, as he said at the very beginning, is to connect recruitment and accommodation. So I was immediately kind of hooked to think, well, how are all of the panelists, such as yourself, Dan, going to come up with a solution for that and make it really, really forward facing? I really liked what Martin Blakely said. He gave some examples of how we've got to look at different types of rooms, and exactly what Deenie and I have been talking about based on our research, that students want something different. There's got to be a different financial model that makes that possible, particularly around shared rooms. I did question about shared bathrooms, and that went down like a lead balloon.
Yeah, it really did.
He didn't believe that A, it would reduce cost, and B, it's what students want. Our research shows differently, but it depends very much on the design and the style of said shared bathroom and how many you're sharing it with. So to caveat, we're talking about people sharing a bathroom in a 4-bedroom flat, akin to a family home or an HMO. We're not talking about massive gym style shower rooms between 16 people. Scott Lewis from Homes for Students just talked about their different brands and how they've got different brands to appeal to different price points, different products, and it enables them to differentiate underneath their Homes for Students umbrella. James Maguire from Housing Hand and Tom Walker from Stu Rents talked about potential changes with the Renters' Rights Bill. I'm sure, we will talk about that in the coming weeks as well. But it was just a bit of a wake-up call, really, that, there are plenty of students that live in HMOs that pay up front for the year or termly, and that may well change moving forward. And Keris from Lancaster Student Union, she talked about something that we've talked about before, that she is disabled, looking for accessible rooms. They're not being marketed. She can't find them. And why is that when we know that every single building has accessible rooms in it? So yeah, all in all, I learnt a lot from the 4 hours, and I would really love for it to move forward, really, to see change. I don't like conferences for the sake of conferences, for the sake of talking. I want all of those brilliant minds that were in that webinar to make a change.
So that does seem to be much more of the conversation this year. Obviously, we're kind of coming to the end of conference season, and I think hopefully we'll start to see that come out in developments. And I know there's still a big question mark around how you pay for it, but that is just a question mark, and I'm sure we've got bright enough minds to work that out. So I think it's all good news, but like you say, it's just now we need to move on to the next phase of it.
I think we're talking about change because it's been a really volatile year in PBSA in particular, but also with student numbers. And, we had the post-COVID boom, and then last year was the first year where it didn't feel like we were shooting fish in a barrel. So there were some occupancy challenges in cities that there hadn't previously been. And I think that was a bit of a shock to the system. It was really interesting hearing Martin Blakey talk about, the need for different stock and different price points. And, he fully acknowledges that it's very difficult to build for under £200 a bed at the moment. So there is that challenge and a real understanding that, investors aren't just not building this stock because they don't want to. It's that, the numbers don't necessarily stack up for the return profiles that they're used to. Yes, there may need to be some adjustments to those expectations, but then do you plough that into another sector, or do you keep it in PBSA, depending on whether you're, a real estate alternative specialist? The thing that frustrated me again is that there was an agent on there again talking about, the chronic undersupply of student accommodation, and I just don't see it. I genuinely don't. We've just got an affordability problem. And again, another report that's come out that I know we're going to talk about next week on the next podcast, but we're still using the wrong language and the wrong figures and misleading. I genuinely think that we're in danger of misleading investors and developers and universities to a certain extent, and leading them down the garden path of, oh yeah, there's going to be so many students coming and, there's so few beds. Well, actually, no, in some locations, and some of the locations that were talked about, some of the students are in BTR, and that's a whole different kettle of fish. We've covered that on several podcasts. Some of the students are staying at home or they're commuting more because they can't afford the properties. You can't just take the total number of students and then the PBSA beds and say 60% of students can't access PBSA beds in Coventry or Nottingham or whatever it might be. They might not necessarily want it. So I think that we've got to be realistic about what we're being told in those glossy sales brochures and in some of these industry reports that are created by agents that are paid on the sale of a property. They're sitting deal side. It's in their interests to have a chronic undersupply so that people think, well, I'll just build whatever, and then or maybe I can make good returns now on my PBSA property. But it just isn't that easy. And I'm not saying that all sales agents are unscrupulous and they're just, deal junkies chasing after the next big sale, because there are some brilliant research functions that sit alongside that. But equally, they're not going to sit there and say, we're actually fine in Nottingham or Leeds, so don't build there. I think that is where we're in slight danger of not having an independent voice. And yes, I would say that because that's what we do. I sit as an independent voice. My consultancy and the consultants I've got working for me, we don't sit deal side. We're not incentivized. We don't get paid on any deals coming off. We literally just do feasibility studies where we are interviewing the universities, recruitment department, the accommodation department. We're speaking to the chief planners in each city, and we're being asked to sit on some of these planning committees now at some of these city councils, which is again really interesting. We're speaking to the investors and the operators, and I'm trying to paint a full picture of it. I'm genuinely not trying to just sell my services here, but we're in danger of marking our own homework, and I think that's what's happened for years. And when times get a bit tougher to get those returns, I think we just need to look a little closer at the figures.
I got called last week by a research company. I'm on their database, and they contact me from time to time to give advice about particular markets. And the lady said, we've got an investor that wants to talk to you, what opportunities are there for high-end PBSA? And I went, well, that's going to be a very, very quick call, because I'm going to say don't do it, basically. Funnily enough, I haven't been called back.
It does depend where it is. It really does. And I think that, there is still a market for high-end PBSA in certain locations. And my goal is to say to councils and anyone else, yes, if you want affordable stock, build more PBSA. It's really simple. Yes, it has to be future-proof. And this is something that I've done a fair bit of work looking at Nottingham in particular. And I think that they're the most forward-thinking city and council in the UK by a country mile, if I'm being completely honest, in terms of their student housing strategy, the way that planning is getting involved in that. And yet there's a cap on studios there, 20% of each new planning application. That's the maximum that you can have as studios within PBSA. And fair enough, because you've got to future-proof that stock. So everyone that's, coming to me saying, "Oh, can I do?" And I get the same kind of calls, Sarah. Can we build premium here and can we build premium there? There are some locations where yes, you can do it. And overall, over time, it may well, the more supply that comes on board, the occupancy level should drop in each PBSA. Everyone recalibrates their rents accordingly, and the student accommodation becomes cheaper. Win-win. Universities are going to love that because they're going to have more affordable stock in their city. The students are going to be paying less for their accommodation. The university rankings should then shoot up as well. So I think that is the only way to really resolve the affordability crisis. Keep building, but understand that those returns might not be there when you do come to sell. That's the caveat that I have to all of my feasibility studies.
I think that's the problem. When you've got a market that is saying that we've got a lack of supply, investors are going into it thinking that they can continue with the great return of view with investors, which I think from the conversations I've had over the last few weeks is beginning to change, is that return profiles are at a certain level, and that might not be the case anymore. And I think, like you say, those dangerous headlines are driving that, because the more you say that, the more people hear that and go, well, I can still get my returns.
But I think, as we've discussed before, if rent goes up all the time from existing properties, if you're building a new build high end, you've got to go in so high because you've got to jump over all of the existing supply that's been putting their prices up and prices up and prices up, which is kind of where we've got to, really. That, and we've seen it through Homes for Students. They've had to invent a whole new category for high end with their Evo brand, because it's the next high end development has got to be even more higher end than the previous high end development, and it's this, we talk about kind of, the arms race of amenities. But as we know, that's not where the bulk is. That's not where the huge, if there is a supply need and if there is a demand, it's not at the high end, it's at the affordable end.
I totally agree. We're not saying on this podcast, we are not saying, don't build, there's enough supply. Categorically not. Like, there is still a massive affordability problem in almost every city. There's a few exceptions there. Coventry, Sheffield, they've been mature for a little while now. They've been dealing with, significant under occupancy, I think you would call it, where it sits at around kind of 70 to 80% for maybe 3-4 years now. Other cities are catching up. So to those investors and developers building now, yes, keep building, but just understand that, if you're going to lean on the research of a sales agent, then you have to understand that they are incentivized to sell that property most of the time. There are some times when it's just a clear-cut piece of research, and that's fine, but it's very difficult to cut through what is and what isn't. So I think we just need to be really mindful of the fact that we can be seen to be marking our own homework at certain times. And I would just be a bit careful with what you're making key decisions on, because we want, on this podcast, as I said, we want more student accommodation built. Overall, then it makes the competition better and stronger. The best performing assets and the best performing operators will win out. And I think that's really important. It will overall bring the occupancy and the rents down for students and make it more affordable. But there will definitely be some developers and investors in the last 2 to 3 years that will get caught up, with overstretched banking covenants because the occupancy and the revenue hasn't been quite as they desired. And if you're a sales agent, you don't have to particularly worry about that in terms of you've walked away. No one's on the hook for that. Once you've sold that property, or you've marketed that property, or it's PC'd or forward funded or whatever, then you can walk away from that. And that's where operators and investors are left to pick up the pieces there, with sometimes mismatched expectations of what reality is. And like I said, just to caveat all of this, there are some brilliant sales agents out there, and they are very honest and very open and transparent about the saturation of certain markets and the price points of certain markets and certain buildings. But as a sector, we really need to be quite careful as to how we're taking some of these reports and research on. And some of the language that we're seeing is at best confusing, at worst misleading. So I think that is probably the most neutral way that I can talk about it. But it is a really difficult topic of conversation when it's the elephant in the room with all of these studies and reports that we see.
Yeah, absolutely agree. It's part of our next topic that actually when you've got investors seeking a certain return and you've got a need to drive down costs is the impact, the human impact of that on the workforce. And I think we've discussed this several times on the podcast around, I guess, the differences between PBSA and BTR around staffing models. That in PBSA, we traditionally have very small staffing models. We do things very lean. We've got a very kind of talented staff that can take on lots of different jobs by one person because they need to. But in BTR, actually, we're seeing much broader staffing structures, far better paid, and there are massive risks to PBSA in that we're going to lose a lot of great talent over to BTR. But there's also a human well-being risk in that actually you're pushing staff constantly to deliver more for less. That's going to have an impact on the day-to-day.
Yeah, we did touch on this at the class conference. I think it was in our women's networking is, there's several strands to this. One is that, the workforce are experiencing anxiety. A lot are being diagnosed with neurodiversity. There is mental health challenges, and we're very vocal about acknowledging this as part of our resident community. But I think we're less vocal about talking about this as part of the workforce and what that means and the extra support that staff need, but also the extra support that the staff need to support students with mental health challenges within the building. There was a comment from one of our participants at the Women's Networking Breakfast that they try and come up with technology solutions and ask for investment. And the first question is, oh, good, you can reduce staff numbers if you input, more technology. And that's not the case. We need more humans, not less humans, to deal with, like you said, Deenie, a massive, massive demanding workload every single day. And I think we have to acknowledge there is no downtime in PBSA. I'm not saying there is in any other rental sectors, but I think in PBSA there is a misleading assumption that there is, but there isn't, because investors need 51 to 52 week returns. So even if you've got a 42-week contract, you're doing summer business, and that's even more stressful than your term time business. The turnaround, the cleaning, the maintenance, we're experiencing, and seeing through our mystery shops that some buildings aren't being maintained as brilliantly as they should. And that's because there's no time to do it. That's adding huge pressure onto staff. And we've had a few messages from people saying, can we talk about burnout? That's the word that they're using. And, we have to call it out that, you need to look after your staff and acknowledge that they cannot deal with everything that's being thrown at them and still provide an amazing service, still collect rent, still have a safe building. They've got to deal with all loads of new regulations around fire safety, around health and safety, around renters' rights bills. Their list just gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and the staffing models don't get bigger.
And absolutely, we do need to review staffing structures based on a changing world, I think. And I'm not sure that's been done. I think we've got historic staffing structures that were where they were when the building was built, and that generally gets maintained. And I think we need to look at this this is not just about staff, this is not just about operators, this has an impact on investors, and that actually PBSA needs to grab hold of what its identity is. And its identity is that it's got the benefit of people that understand students in that building, which BTR doesn't. And if you continue to put pressure on those people that are doing that, then you're not even going to have that. And then that has an impact on, well, I might as well go to BTR. So I think it is about staff, but it's also about the business models, and it's about actually maintaining occupancy in those buildings, that actually, if you want to attract students who want to be looked after in a building, and our research time and time again says that students want to be in a building that understands and knows students, if that's your unique selling point, then it's the people that make that happen, and it's the people you need to look after.
I think this is the tip of the iceberg. I think stress within PBSA, property management in particular, is a real problem that the sector hasn't fully addressed. I think it's probably more endemic in third-party operations, not because those third-party operators don't care or don't have the HR set up or anything like that, but because investors are definitely much more demanding, in my experience through consultancy, with third-party operators. And that may be through the sales process. They're sort of sold the dream, as it were, that, you can have these returns and operate on a shoestring. And this is a people business. PBSA is a people business. And at the end of the line, dealing on the front line with the residents, that's people, and it always will be, however much I talk about AI. And I think that we, as a sector in PBSA, we don't pay as well as BTR. General managers are paid more in BTR than they are in PBSA. So there's a certain amount of brain drain going on where BTR is picking up people at HQ level, but also at property level as well. And in my opinion, it's easier to manage a BTR property. You don't have quite as many mental health issues as you would do with PBSA and students, and the demands on students are higher than ever. So I do think this is very much the tip of the iceberg, especially after a year where investors have struggled with occupancy in certain locations, and they're that is also off the back of a couple of years of astronomical utilities costs and higher staff salaries than previously, but those salaries were from a very low base anyway. So I do think that investors are now starting to think, right, how can I trim my OPEX? What can I do? And anyone who's looking to sell, if you've got a portfolio up for sale, you'll trim the OPEX straight away because you want to show the best possible NOI. And hopefully, if you're selling within that year, you could reduce your staff numbers and it won't affect the reviews until you've sold the property effectively. And then the next owner of that property has that sort of lag on bad reviews to deal with later down the line when people check out or whatever it might be. So, yeah, I think there's a real endemic problem in PBSA that does need to be addressed. And we're so focused on the pastoral care of the resident. We do need to be looking internally at our staff, at our teams, and say, are you well supported? Is everything in place for you if you are under a huge amount of stress, or are you at risk of burnout? So it's time to be proactive. Like, all senior managers should be asking their teams, do you feel well supported? And is burnout something that is on your radar? Because we all need to take a step back every now and again and just think, geez, that is actually what we do on a day-to-day basis as property teams in particular. It's bloody hard work. And I have the ultimate respect for any property manager. I've seen it firsthand. I see it on a day-to-day basis. And the really good ones take their work home with them. They're there, constantly. They get up early, get straight into the office. They'll leave late on at night. Like it is a 24/7 job. You're always on call. And that has to give at some point. So, yeah, it's definitely time to look internally. And we do need to think about what that means and how we can support our teams better.
I don't think it's property level, can I just say? I think, it's at corporate level, it's at head office level. As a marketing director, I've had challenges within my team previously. And if somebody needs to take a mental health break, it doesn't mean that there is enough people to take on, those roles, the job that would be done otherwise. So, I think at all levels, there needs to be a real hard look at the culture of the workplace. And, there's some great work going on. We really see it coming out. And I think as long as that translates into reality, it's not just, shiny marketing campaigns to recruit new people, that actually it matters and it makes a difference and people are supported, at property level. And I think, regarding what you just said about kind of investor models and OPEX, the classic scenario will be an acquisitions director putting an investment appraisal together, not asking the ops director, the marketing director and the HR director, just doing what's always been done. And then someone will catch sight of it and say, well, hold on, no, we need more staff, we need more marketing budget, etc. And then them going, well, no, we can't put that in because we'll never get it past investment appraisal. And therefore it doesn't. And therefore that's been underwritten and it never changes.
Totally. And it's the same for third-party tender processes as well. And I'm in the midst of those at the moment. I've got 3 live at the minute. It's fascinating to see the actual weeds of what each operator is proposing. And then to get the feedback from the investor or developer as to, oh, hang on, that has a negative impact on the NOI. So maybe we don't either go for that brand or we just ask them to reduce staffing. And of course, if I was just doing a very simple tender process, I would probably say, yeah, okay, go back to the operator and we'll say that. But I think in what I understand of the sector, I know that will be detrimental for the property and the students and, the investment as a whole. So I'm able to educate the investor and the developer and say, trust me, you don't want that. Like, what you actually need for your long-term business goal or your short-term business goal is ultimately happy students, happy staff. And so I am able to cut through that a little bit. But you're totally right. There's always a mismatch between investors and the operator side of things, and that's really important that we can mitigate that with open communication on exactly what's required to run a property. And Sarah, you're totally right about it being a headquarters issue as well. At Nido, I think I had about 5 people take mental health breaks of varying different degrees, from a week to sort of 3 months or so, and that was before anyone really fully invested in mental health, or there weren't really mental health first aiders. This is sort of 7 years ago now. And so, yes, it is a real problem at HQ level too, as well as the properties. So yeah, you're right to bring that up.
Yeah, I think the message when you're buying a building, yes, you're buying a building, but if you are operating that building for the benefit of rental income, that it's people that make that happen. And if you don't look after the people, you don't fill up your building, you don't look after your building. And I think it's time and time again when we go and do our consultancy with clients and we're starting at brand and product, is that the center of that product and the center of that brand is the people that are running those buildings and operating those buildings, and they need to be looked after and supported. So, and it's a perfect time of year, I guess, to reach out to staff and just, as you say, just check they're all right, check everyone's got room to breathe, and what we can all do as a sector, because ultimately we are all in it together. And I think this doesn't get discussed enough, is that actually investors can't achieve their goals without actually working closely with operators and property managers, because that's how we all win, by working together. So yeah, watch this space. But some good news in the sector, some things that often, I guess, get talked about when money is tight, that actually you don't look at sustainability or social value. But we have recently had the good news that 2 people in the shared living sector have recently been accredited with B-Corp. Mies was the first to achieve this, and followed shortly after by the Social Hub, I think within the same week. So I think that's really good news, and I know it's something that you both are passionate about. So what's your thoughts?
Yeah, it's great to see. We know that a lot of work goes into it. This isn't just a simple, tick box exercise. It's, months, if not years of work meeting the B Corp accreditation process. And I think one of the things that's probably misleading for anyone out there that thinks it's not for them, it's not about the environment. I think a lot of people think it's kind of a green, environmental, sustainable kind of stamp, if you like. But actually, a lot of it is about kind of social sustainability. It's about community. It's about your supply chain. It's about being a fair employer. And all of those things contribute to it. So I don't think anybody should dismiss it or think that they can't achieve it, because clearly we've got 2 fantastic role models in the sector that have achieved it. And like I said, it's not easy. It needs time, it needs resource, but they're all really, really sensible things that, even if you apply and aren't successful, I think it'll probably change your business forever for the good.
As I say, I think it really highlights that actually there's small changes that you can do that are the better for your environment and your stakeholders, that actually have a positive impact on your business. And I think unless you go through that process, you tend not to see it that way. And I think that's where it can be really powerful.
Yeah, I mean, I know Stuart Henderson has now gone to Luna, but he was instrumental in that being a differentiator for Mies, and obviously he had the backing of Aberdeen and Murdo and Dave and the team there. It takes a lot to actually really invest in it, not from a financial point of view, but giving all of the tools and handing it over and saying, right, go and get us B Corp, because we feel like a B2C certification, as in, something that students and residents will understand, is going to be a real differentiator and a competitive advantage for us, further down the line. I think this is the way that everybody should be going, personally. From a B2B standpoint, yes, your BREEAMs, your Passive House, your Fitwell, your Well, your whatever else, whatever other certifications, they are going to be looked for on a property basis. But as a company, That's what B Corp tells anyone that looking to align themselves with you as a brand or invest in you or work with you, that you are a good company and that you are effectively a force for good. That's the reason behind B Corp. Showcase that you are a force for good. And you're right, it's not just environment, it's the social, it's the governance side of things as well. There can be some awkward conversations and elephants in the room there, and in particular with regards to where funds are based or where they're from. So that's a real challenge, because I'd say the majority of properties in PBSA, the propcos are probably sat somewhere in Guernsey or Luxembourg or Liechtenstein or various other places as well, and that is a bit of a challenge to achieve B Corp. But there are definite ways of doing it, and there's ways of mitigating that, but making sure that you're paying the right taxes, because that's part of B Corp, and really that you're looking after your people, your residents, your staff, the environment. It's an all-encompassing certification. So well done to the Social Hub and Mies for getting that. That is pioneering the sector. I'd love to see more operators get that and really sort of drive the standards forward, because it's the most all-encompassing B2C certification that I've seen out there. And we've worked with a fair few companies helping them to get their B Corp certification. It used to take anything sort of 3 to 6 months. Now you're at about 2 years, and I think that says a lot for, firstly, how many people are actually applying to B Corp now, and the fact that there's a limited number of people actually dealing with these applications, but also then how much goes into actually creating that certification. Mies, I think, thought they were going to get it within a year, and it took probably more like 18 months, maybe even 2 years. So it's definitely worth investigating now. I would certainly advise operators to do that, because the moment students really start voting with their feet on sustainability, and we are a little way off that yet, it's it's number 5 or lower on their list of decision making reasons for choosing student accommodation at the moment, sustainability, but that will creep up. And at which point, when it becomes about marginal gains, B Corp is definitely going to help. So well done to those guys. I think there's a really important step for the entire sector, and hopefully it's just the start of many more going for B Corp.
And I think it's got, as a logo and an accreditation, it's got real brand value. And it is a piece of research actually that we are looking at doing around kind of the understanding of accreditation in the sector. And actually, I think that B Corp, I know from my perspective, I see a B Corp organisation, like you say, Dan, I instantly know that they're doing the right thing. They're probably kind, they're probably good people to work with. And I'm more inclined to go and work with an organisation that's B Corp than I am that's not. And I think that transcends into the student world. So I think it's got real brand value and really powerful. On the topic of research, I think we just wanted to share that we do actually have a new piece of research from our youth forum, which is the first time we've partnered with Student Crowd. And that is coming out this week and it's actually quite fascinating. We won't go into detail now because we're running out of time, but really fascinating on kind of the terminology around how students understand what we're selling them. And it's not quite as clean cut as you might think. And I think we have a lot of work to do. So do keep your eye out for that report that is going to be hitting your inboxes and our social media soon, because I think you will find it quite fascinating. But I think we have probably chatted enough for this week. Thank you so much for listening. And thank you once again to our sponsor, My Student Halls, for sponsoring this series. We'll be back next week for more news and insight. So please subscribe and share.